Welcome to part 4 of How the Self Evolves. This is Jürgen Rasmussen. Welcome to the Provocative Hypnosis vlog. So, as I said, this is part 4 of How the Self Evolves. We're going to be deep diving into Kegan stage 5, or the self-transforming mind. So what's going on with self-transforming minds? Well, the first thing you probably want to be aware of is that this is a relatively rare shift, according to Robert Kegan and writers such as Jennifer Garvey Berger, who's written some good books on this stuff. Maybe 5-6% of the adult population in the Western world are kind of transitioning from a self-authored towards that more self-transforming mind. And when it comes to people who actually live from that self-transforming mind fully, we're probably talking about something like 1% of the population. So this is quite different and quite rare. So what's going on here? What is self? What is other? Well, you'll remember that the self-authoring mind is subject to his or her own inner system of values and principles and premises. That's who they are, seemingly. They view the world through that inner system. So what happens with the self-transforming mind is that that inner system, that inner self system that looked like who they were, begins to be taken as object. It begins to be seen as an idea, as a construct. No longer who they are, but more like self-convenient fiction. It no longer looks like they are a self. It looks as if there's this selfing process going on where the self gets constructed and deconstructed and reconstructed. And it might even be seen that, hey, wait a minute. Like the writer Virginia Woolf used to say, we have as many I's or selves as we have relationships. That the self or I that shows up seemingly in one context can be quite different than the self that shows up in another context. So self is seen as more fluid and dynamic and changing, and instead of there being one autonomous, solid, strong self, it's more like a multi-self version. And so if we take then, let's say a romantic relationship, if you remember back to the self-authoring mind, here you have two partners, two independent, whole, complete selves that enter into a partnership. And when there's a conflict in that self-authored relationship, it's viewed more as like a trip. I'm going to try to understand my partner and see the world from his or her perspective and experience how they see the world, right? And let's negotiate and stuff like that. The self-transforming mind is more likely to see it as two people pretending to be complete, meaning the selfing process or idea of who they are is just like an idea of who they are, and per definition incomplete and partial. So when there's a long-standing conflict in a significant relationship, it's more likely to be viewed as the problem is there to solve you. Not so much you solving a problem, but the problem solving you. Meaning the conflict might be a sign that you are too strongly identified with one aspect of a polarity, and that the other seems to be holding the other aspect of the polarity for you. And the conflict is an opportunity for you to recover more of your own complexity, meaning to find more of what the other seems to represent internally as part of your own self. So people who have more access to this self-transforming mind will likely be more aware of their own shadow and be looking to integrate their own shadow. So, for example, Carl Jung used to say that we have a tendency to marry our own unconscious mind, that we have a tendency to project out, aspects of ourselves that we're not willing to see, and to see it in something or someone there with the greatest hook, right? So let's say you drive out of your driveway and you see your neighbor, and the lawn is perfect, or they've shoveled snow in a way that's so pedantic, and let's say that grabs at you and irks you, right? That compulsive, pedantic neighbor. Well, the fact that you have such a strong response is probably a signal that you have more of those tendencies in yourself than you're quite aware of. So it's being projected onto the neighbor with the strongest hook. So the conflict then could be there to help you recover more of your own complexity. Kind of like a cross training project. Another really interesting thing here, too, is people who have some of these self transforming capacities begin to see more of their own bullshit. They begin to see more of their own bullshit, and just how self serving this fictional self and selfing system really is. You start to become aware of the selfing game, meaning how our minds project other people to be a particular way, so that when we see them that way and they act that out, that reinforces our particular self-image. So let's say, for example, that you have a self-concept as a just person, or a strong person, or a responsible person. Your mind then might project onto other people that they are irresponsible and weak and vulnerable, and because the more you see them that way, and the more they kind of accept that role, the more that reinforces your self-concept as the responsible one. You see this sometimes in therapists, who might have a strong self-concept of being a benevolent person, a compassionate person, a very caring, empathetic person, and they see victims everywhere. They see the vulnerabilities and the frailties in other people who need to be saved and rescued, and the more they see other people in that way, and other people are willing to act out that role, the more it reinforces their self-concept as a compassionate, benevolent, good person, for example. Now, I'm not saying that there might not be some truth in some of these mind projections, but what I'm pointing out is that when people develop some of these self-transforming mind capacities, they begin to see more how full of shit they are, and how self-serving a lot of this stuff is. I'm reminded of Thomas Szasz, the famous psychiatrist who was a strong critic of psychiatry, one of my favorite thinkers. He had a profound ability to kind of uncover the deeper assumptions of society, and see behind the system, and to make these deeper cultural assumptions visible. He has a quote where he says something to the effect of, a friendship is two people who have agreed to uphold each other's mythologies. So I don't think he thinks that's all a friendship is, but there's this aspect of, if you and I are friends, you have a particular self-concept or identity that you might be fused with. And my role then as a friend is to reinforce that you are that person. And your job is to kind of do that with me, and the friendship then kind of serves the function of upholding each of our mythologies. And if you look at life, you'll see just how much of conflict, you know, that really revolves around maintaining and protecting and bolstering our own identities, and how a lot of what we see in others and see as necessary for changing and saving the world might have a lot to do with that. So when that's seen a bit more, it tends to humble people uh, quite a bit. Um, so for example, with the therapist then, who might view himself or herself as, as strong and competent and wise, and who might have a need to project the patient to be a victim and to be helpless, that, of course, if the patient doesn't play out that role, it might offend the psychiatrist or the psychologist or the therapist. A self-transforming mind, hopefully, would be more able to see that selfing game and to find more of the vulnerabilities in himself, and to find more of the strength in the client. There's a relationship to relationships and conflict here too, that says that the relationship has the parts, and that any long-standing relationship or conflict probably should be there. Like if you take one example, like the political right and the political left. I'm personally not a big fan of either, but that problem, that conflict probably should be there. It's there prior to that individual Republican or Democrat, as an opportunity for the Democrat to find more of the Republican inside him or herself, and for the Republican to find more of the Democratic stuff inside of him or herself. And as a result of that, recovering more of their own complexity. There's something really interesting too that tends to happen. So remember that self-authoring mind, that's Piaget's formal operations at full power. The thinking process. It's a very, if you ever read Ian McGilchrist's work, The Master and His Emissary, if you haven't, I highly recommend it. Very interesting stuff. That modernistic way of thinking, where you have the maximum separation between subject and object, where the world seems to consist of a multiplicity of separate objects appearing to a separate subject. This is a very reductionistic, kind of left hemispheric way of thinking with very strict boundaries. What seems to happen when people begin to make that shift towards a more self-transformational mind is that there's a loosening of that. There's a deeper access to one's own subjective inner experience. People begin to see more of the subjectivity behind the alleged objectivity. So there's often more skepticism of this idea of objective truth, that you can find these absolute truths. What tends to happen when people move beyond that formal operations is that subject and object, instead of the knower and the known, instead of it being seen as completely distinct, you're beginning to be seen as part of the same process, or even as one, as indistinguishable. Instead of seeing a world of separate objects and polarities, people begin to see that this is a function of human thought and language. We think in categories. As John Grinder, the NLP co-founder, often says, language, concepts, categories, language imposes these constructs, these categories onto the flow of experience which aren't inherently there. And then that begins to look at as reality. So instead of so many dichotomies, there's more shades of gray. There's more an appreciation often of not knowing, uncertainty, greater tolerance of ambiguity and paradox. Instead of these strong dichotomies where you see things as kind of either or, they're more seen as both and, or as co-constructing each other. So let's say you have a typical strength versus vulnerability, and language makes it seem as if these are two distinct things. The self-transforming mind might more see the strength in vulnerability, or the vulnerability in that particular way of conceptualizing strength, or the concepts of knowing and not knowing. It might be seen that, hey, wait a minute, every way of knowing is simultaneously a form of not knowing, because all maps are incomplete and partial. So this is a quite different way of viewing life in the world. It tends to be a more interdependent, systemic way of thinking. Instead of a strong emphasis on cause and effects, people who operate here more often seem to think in terms of emergence. Regarding personal responsibility, quite often that begins to become deconstructed. This whole notion of one's own personal authority and even the self itself. Like, people begin to see that the self itself doesn't really exist. It's an illusion of sorts. It's a tool. It's a process. So this whole idea of agency, this idea that I decide and I do things, when it's seen that the I is really just an afterthought or another thought, if there's no doer behind the doing, so to speak, then the whole notion of free will can easily fall away. I'm not saying that that's going to happen for everyone but what I will claim is that if the self is seen as a process of selfing, and if it's seen that there's no thing like self there's no decider behind the decision, or chooser behind the choice, or thinker behind the thought, then there's no one there to have the free will either. Sure, there's intending and everything's just kind of emerging, but this whole idea of agency and free choice, because the other side of the coin of seeing the self as an illusion is seeing that there's no one really there to have free will, right? So that might be a radical shift. In some funny ways, it can sound a bit like, there's this British prison psychiatrist called, Theodore Dalrymple, which is his pen name, obviously. He's got a really good book called The Knife Went In, and he talks about his time with murderers. And that the most typical thing they would often say is, and then the knife went in. Like, it's that other people made me do it. I'm not responsible. I'm not, the knife just went in. But when you listen to, or when you have that experience of the self being an illusion, life, there's no basis for victimhood, because there's no other to do things to you or to have free will either. So It is just kind of life unfolding, and you know, personal responsibility being, more of a social contract, or yeah, we hold each other accountable as a social contract, and the fact that we hold each other accountable becomes part of the web of information that influences how life emerges in the next moment. Um, so that might be quite different as well. There's other things that tend to happen. There's a guy called Daniel Kahneman who was a psychologist who won the Nobel Prize in economics. He wrote a book called Thinking Fast and Slow. I think he kind of points to some of this stuff. He made a very big point out of that we humans tend to confuse internal coherence with validity, or a full understanding of something. So let's say, for example, let's say that you're an NLPer, for example, and you go to an NLP course, and you learn all these interesting things, and your world is on fire, right? And you come home and you speak to your uncle or your cousin or your friend, and you start telling about what you learned, and but before you can complete two sentences, they go, "Oh yeah, yeah, I get it. It's positive thinking. Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's CBT." And you kind of know that they really have no reference for what you're talking about already, but they think they do. And what's happened is that they've taken potentially new information, and they've filtered it into a kind of map that was there prior to the conversation. And as a result of being able to put those pieces together, they get a sense of internal coherency, which they then confuse with having a full understanding of something. Of course, this is very typical when people have little knowledge about a topic. They, as Kahneman would say, what you see is all there is. Like, I don't see much, so there really isn't that much to see, right? So what I'm pointing to here is that one tendency I see in some of the people who seem to have moved a bit into that self-transforming mind is a kind of skepticism towards feelings of knowing and feelings of certainty. Because we're aware that, yeah, I've been able to take the pieces of my internal puzzle and put them together, so I have a feeling of internal coherence. Let me not confuse that with validity or having a full understanding of something. So they might view that, they might view the feeling of certainty as a signal to open back up and get curious about what they may have missed. So that's an interesting thing. They might be more aware of factors such as confirmation bias and really do their best to have their own filters and values challenged. So, the self-transforming mind might be, as I said in the previous video, quite interested in other viewpoints and learning new things, as long as it fits their own agenda and their own inner self system. Otherwise, they have a tendency to just ignore it and not really see it. So they might be very interested in an opposing view to sharpen their own argument, in a sense. The self-transforming mind seems to be more, since they can take that inner system of knowing more as objects, they're more curious about being wrong or being incomplete. They're more likely to seek out information that doesn't fit their current way of knowing, and to seek out information that might destabilize their own system. because again, they're less likely to confuse internal coherence with validity. They're less likely to confuse the map with the territory. A bit like this selfing process or idea of who they are. They're less likely to confuse that idea of who they are with the entirety of who they are. You know, a person who operates from perhaps a more self-authoring or socialized or mid-zone might be more likely to take a big five personality assessment or Myers-Briggs or and go, yeah, this is who I am. I am my personality, or this captures me. It's less likely to 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 fly with the self-transforming mind. They might view it as a partial map, a useful map that might capture and point to something, but not the not really the complexity of who they are. Susanne Greuter, who I mentioned previously, who's a pioneer in researching ego development. She kind of carried on the work of Jane Loevinger. And of course, ego development is not the same as Kegan's model. It has certain overlaps. She makes a very interesting point. And that point is that the newborn baby seems to really have no distinctions. It's one with its environment. There's no self. There's no self or other. It's this kind of unconscious unity. And then as people evolve and grow, it's initially throughout the early and more conventional stages of development, it's a matter of seeing more patterns, learning new things, getting smarter, gaining more knowledge, succeeding within the system, becoming smarter, in a sense, developing a independent, autonomous self that's kind of separate from the world. And that reaches its peak at the self-authoring stage. But that when people begin to move beyond that, there's a tendency to become more curious about uncovering deeper assumptions, seeing beneath and behind the systems of dissolving the mind, of deconstructing that illusory sense of self, and ultimately moving to a felt unity with life itself and all beings, which is more of a conscious unity. I remember I attended a seminar with Robert Kegan once, and I asked him, like, what would you think would be, I can't remember if I said the full stage 5 or what might come after stage 5 as a stage 6, but he said something to the effect of it would be the self growing and identifying with all of life, essentially, like taking everything as object. Because initially there's no distinction, and then it's kind of me against the world, and then it's kind of us against them, and then it's often a more world-centric view. And there's a very interesting, there's a spiritual teacher by the name of Adyashanti. He retired a while back, but his writings seem to point a little bit in that direction of a self-transforming mind, I think, just like John Grinder's writing does, not from a spiritual perspective, but from a different perspective. And he talks about, he gives this wonderful example. I don't know if it's his or if it's, but I like to borrow it from him. And that is that, imagine in science class, the teacher telling you in school, that's a tree. And the tree needs sunlight and water and soil, and it sounds right. It's useful. That's how we use language. We kind of carve experience up into, again, a multiplicity of seemingly separate objects appearing to a separate subject. But of course, this is a thought construct. This is created by language and thinking. It's not inherent in experience. And it makes it seem as if the tree is a separate object that's dependent upon these other things. But the point he makes is that actually there's no separate object called the tree. The whole of life essentially arises as one process. The tree is the sunlight, it is the soil, it is the water. It all arises as one process. It's the human mind that carves experience up into a multiplicity of seemingly separate objects appearing to a separate subject. So an increased capacity to kind of see that in a more interdependent orientation. So sometimes I like to play with clients, with this, and they come in and they say, well, I'm like this or I'm like that, and I ask them, well, who are you? And if I ask them who they are, they either talk about, what they like to do or their profession or the fact that they have kids but more commonly, they will mention personality tendencies. They'll say, I'm a kind person, I'm a people person, or I'm a very conscientious person, or I'm an anxious person. That's just who I am. So I say to them, are you the sun? Are you the oxygen? And they usually, I do it with smiles. They usually chuckle a bit and they start laughing and they go, no, of course not. As if I'm asking the silliest, stupidest question in the world, right? But again, it seems as if they are this separate human being who's separate from the sun and who's separate from the oxygen. But as Adyashanti would point out there, you are the total environment. There's no you separate from the oxygen and the sun. If this you as an organism arise as parts of that process that everything arises out of. It's the human mind that goes, oh yeah, I'm this mind body in here and the world is out there. So as I like to point out to the clients, you're not always conscientious or you're not always anxious. Or if that anxiety went away, you would still be you as an organism. But if the sun suddenly disappeared or the oxygen disappeared, what's called you as a distinct, mind-body organism would instantly dissolve. So from that perspective, you are the sun. You are the oxygen. You are life itself unfolding. And as part of that, there's this selfing process that identifies and disidentifies and re-identifies. So, what might be some of the, not minuses necessarily, but one thing that Susanne Greuter points out regarding late stage development, and I have seen this myself in the people that I suspect have some of this self-transforming stuff going on, is that they tend to drop out of the rat race. They tend to drop out of corporations and organizations, that achiever mindset, the constant self-improvement project, those seem to lose their appeal for the most part. There's usually more an emphasis on either just understanding or being, just living life. They don't usually care that much whether they achieve or not, even though paradoxically they might achieve quite a bit. Fear and compulsiveness seem to be dampened down. They drop out of corporations and organizations like the status game, the climbing, playing the game no longer seems to appeal to them. They tend to do their own thing. They might come in as consultants and do work. Um, a lot of these people have some sense of loneliness because, again, kind of paradoxically, there might be more of this interdependent view and less of an identification with the mind and the personality and stuff like that. But there's also this recognition that almost no one sees life or the world as they do. So they often feel that they are always the ones who adapt. And for other people, spending time with someone who operates here can seem confusing and just plain wrong because it's so different from where they operate. And society kind of rewards the socialized mind, again, isn't really up to par for a modern society, but we're kind of encouraged to become socialized, and that kind of expert stage, whether society really encourages self-authorship, I think is quite debatable. But there's few incentives in society to move to that self-transforming mind. Um, so regarding change work then and therapy, these folks, I mean, they can get stuck and tripped up and have their rough moments like everyone else. Um, if you can have those kind of deep explorations and conversations and meditations with them, regarding the nature of reality and the self, and that's often where these people love to operate. Remember that a lot of psychotherapy and coaching really is geared towards that socialized towards self-authoring shift, finding your own voice, that sort of stuff. Therapists often strike out with the sovereign mind and those who are kind of moving from the self-sovereign mind towards the socialized mind, because for those people it's not really so much often about developing self-authorship. It might be more about becoming more socialized and actually internalizing a philosophy and stuff like that. And the same with the self-transforming mind. If someone here comes to therapy and you have a therapist who wants to work on self-authorship, well, that's exactly the place that they've kind of left. So that might not necessarily be a great match. Um, Something else that's interesting too, and I'm not saying that this is the case for everyone who develops some of these tendencies, but when people begin to see more of how language shapes their experience and just how constructed things are, and they have more tolerance of ambiguity and ease with paradox and stuff like that, there's often a preference for simplicity. Like, these people often get more simple in a sense. They just want to live life. There's a preference to coming as close as they can to direct experience again, while simultaneously knowing that they can't quite, like it's not quite possible. They're often more spontaneous. There's often more flow states. There's a simplicity. That they can be more eccentric and unconventional, and just have a very fresh and very different take on things than most people do. Regarding and there's usually more shades of gray. The self-authoring mind can be very ideological, and this is who I am and this is what I stand for. The self-transforming mind can do that too, as a choice, but there's usually more shades of gray. They're often harder to pin down. There's that tendency to take their thinking seriously is kind of reduced. One more point, regarding awakening. So I forgot to talk about this in the tape, in the video about self-authorship, but it's kind of paradoxical if someone's moving towards that self-authoring mind and the self is seen as an illusion, because they're kind of in a phase of life where constructing that and identifying with it seems to be the next step on the journey. I think this is where a lot of non-duality teachings and meditation can sometimes backfire a bit, is you have meditation teachers who try to deconstruct what a lot of people haven't really constructed for themselves. Like this tendency to develop a seemingly strong, independent, autonomous self seems to be part of the natural evolution of things, right? But so if someone has a strong awakening at that more self-authoring stage, I think there's a couple of things that are likely to happen. One is that the selfing process kicks straight back in and kind of creates an identity or a self out of being the one who's awakened, which is kind of paradoxical. Um, and or it might jolt people a bit into that self-transforming territory. Now, I think that, and this might be one of the reasons why these awakening experiences and realizations might not be that lasting, or that people might have a lot of trouble really living from there. I think if someone has moved into at least having strong self authorship, or perhaps even some of the self transforming mind, if they then have an awakening, that's kind of like a perfect shift. So when I look at some of these meditation teachers who seem to have had radical awakenings which have lasted and which have transformed how they see the world, I'm thinking about Gary Weber, who reported that back in 1998, self-referential thinking just stopped for the most part, and all of the fears and all of the compulsions associated with that just went away. He was at the time in his late 40s, I think, and he had a very strong self-authoring mind and was probably kind of moving into that self-transforming zone. If you look at Byron Katie, she was in her 40s. Byron Katie, by the way, is a wonderful source to read, I think, if you want a taste of that kind of self-transforming mind. Byron Katie is a good choice. Gary Weber's books are a good choice. That's kind of the more meditative, spiritual realm. I think Ian McGilchrist's books, like The Master and His Emissary, point to this a bit. John Grinder, the NLP co-founder, Robert Anton Wilson, Thomas Sauce, as I mentioned, just because of that deep ability to see the deeper assumptions behind culture and society. Um, so that might be one reason, that awakening experiences don't quite last. I might be wrong on this. I mean, I can immediately think of counterexamples. I can think of Ramana Maharshi, who had this full-blown awakening experience at age 16, which seemed to be permanent and profound. And a 16-year-old is not going to be grown up in that way. So, anyways, here are a few things that kind of excite me. So, So again, when Kegan says that 1% of the population are at this self-transforming mind, 5 or 6% are in the transition, I think you're going to see more people operating from this space, and more people I think already are at a younger age because these developmental models have become available. I think there's something very developmental, can be at least, about studying these developmental models, because you get to look at it and go, huh, I never seen that. That's new. That's And I see this with clients too. Like sometimes for fun, I take ways of making meaning, like shadow work, for example, and I kind of ask clients to engage in those practices. These are things they've never thought about doing. It's not part of their map. They wouldn't have done that naturally. But some of them, some of the time, are able to get great benefits from it. I also quite often have experiences of helping people have insights into the illusory nature of their experience that I think, according to, in theory, where they are developmentally, they shouldn't have access to. But by doing thought experiments with them and guiding them and helping them to make discoveries, these days too, I mean, you have systems like metacognitive therapy, acceptance and commitment therapy, RABT. You have so many sources. You have great meditation teachers. You can look at developmental models, and you can play with ways of making sense of the world which aren't natural to you, that wouldn't have come naturally, but you can, through a coach or through these models, entice new ways of operating or making meaning. So that's really interesting too. And finally, I'd like to repeat the kind of warnings that I started with. A, please don't hold Bob Kegan responsible for these videos. He might be pulling his hair out if he hears any of this, for all I know. Maybe he'll like parts of it, who knows. But this is my interpretation based upon my studies of the model and the context in which I operate. So hold me responsible for that. And also know that people aren't blank slates. Biological sex, male brains and female brains are somewhat different. So whether you're a male or female will likely influence this, the culture that you live in, and also your personality tendencies. And these things will influence how these systems play out. One thing that seems pretty certain, though, is that if you want to develop into more of these later stages of development, curiosity. Curiosity seems to be the master key. That seems to be a common denominator of those who kind of get to operate at later stages, is that curiosity and that wanting to figure things out and wanting to discover the inadequacies in your very own forms of meaning making. So again, that was a lot of rambling by me in the end. I hope you've enjoyed this free 4-part series on YouTube on how the self evolves. If you have questions, agree, disagree, have any input, I would love to hear it. As always, if you would like to explore some coaching or change work with me, you can find me at provocativehypnosis.com. There's also some interesting seminars going on, so you can check that too at the seminar page at provocativehypnosis.com. So, till next time.